Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Center for the Humanities Brown Bag series. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities, and I'm delighted to see so many people showing up in person, as well as our friends who are Zooming in from wherever they are. I would like to introduce Professor Matt Podler from the Department of Communication Studies, who teaches sports media and communication, and Matt is going to introduce Scott and moderate the discussion. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you all. So I'm very pleased to introduce Scott today in this talk. Scott is currently an assistant professor of communication studies in the Harrington School of Communication and Media. And in his research and teaching, Scott takes a cultural and media studies approach, broadly construed, toward analyzing, among other things, media and technologies of surveillance and control. He has published work in space and culture, internet histories, convergence, new media and society, and teaching media quarterly. His recent article in Convergence is of particular interest to me as a fellow Fish fan and jam band fan, where he explores how changing media conditions can affect and or influence new collection practices via a case study on a fish listening app. Also of note, Scott is a fantastic and supportive colleague to new faculty and veteran faculty alike. So I'm really happy to see like a pretty good crowd here for a Thursday afternoon at URI with nice weather. And in his talk today, entitled "No Unseated Crowd is Liable to be Orderly," got the right one, the technological control of industrial age audiences, Scott explores a history of crowd control technologies in cultural spaces like theaters, arenas, the stadium. So please, Scott, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt, for such a kind, generous introduction. I'll just echo back that if you've not yet had the chance to meet Matt Podler, Matt is also, he's a fabulous colleague, generous with his time and his ideas, and I'm really grateful that you agreed to moderate today. I should also, while I'm saying thank you, I'd love to extend my warm thanks to Eve Stern and Laura Stifler from the Center for the Humanities for putting this all together so that those of you here and those of you there could join us. I'm really thrilled to be in a room with people. This is like fun and different and new. I've missed doing this. I've been excited about the chance to share this work with people. I haven't given a talk at URI in 6 years, I think, because I technically run the lecture series in the Harrington School, which means you don't get to show your own work. So I'm really excited. This is a project I've been working on for a couple of years, and I'm excited to share it with you and see what you think. I've been very fortunate as I've been working on this project. It's gotten generous support from the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the Council for Research here at URI, the College of Arts and Sciences, and also the Center for the Humanities. They've all provided funding that's supported the research you're about to hear from or hear about. So Andy Frayne called himself a crowd engineer. By the early 1960s, his eponymous ushering services firm spread from its Chicago headquarters to some 24 American cities. Frayne understood his work as, among other things, supervising the control of crowds attending public events, keeping out crashers and mooches, soothing drunks, making plans for such emergencies as fire and sudden rain, seeing to it that fans get to their seats with the minimum of confusion, and that once there, in the vast majority of cases, they stay put. Engineering a crowd for Frayne meant designing, monitoring, and ultimately controlling the movements of spectators at sporting events, political conventions, fashion shows, fireworks displays, even funerals. But it also meant arranging spectators in a way that conformed to the racial and social logics of the mid-century United States. Frayne's firm was hired to manage the crowd at the March 13th, 1961 boxing match between Ingmar Johansson and Floyd Patterson in Miami Beach. The fight attracted nearly 32,000 spectators to the convention hall, And among Frame's strategies for controlling them was a set of 70 desirable seats that were left unoccupied for what he called minor emergencies. What constituted a minor emergency? According to Sports Illustrated, which did a profile of Frame that year, people who wanted to punch their neighbors and persons who objected to sitting next to a Negro fight fan. Frame had insisted, as a condition of his taking the job, that seating at the Johansson-Patterson fight be integrated. But he granted racist requests from individual patrons unable to bear the stress of sitting next to a Black person, presumably in order to ensure that the audience members would collectively stay put. The accommodation of racial animus was but one tool deployed in pursuit of a well-engineered crowd. It seems obvious, but it's worth noting explicitly that crowd engineering means engineering a crowd. A crowd is not a natural thing that occurs. It is produced through a technical process. But ushering wasn't the only sort of engineering that sought to act upon the minds and bodies of spectators. I'll introduce another character, William N. Woodbury. He was another engineer, but he was a civil engineer, someone that we might more readily recognize as an engineer. By the time he retired in 1951, he had designed and built football stadiums from Florida to New England and Colorado to the Atlantic Ocean, including additions to the Orange Bowl and the Sugar Bowl. Near the end of his book, near the end of his career, he published a book called Grandstand and Stadium Design, where he offered counsel regarding a stadium's ideal shape and ellipse, the slope of its risers, increasing with distance from the field, and the competing demands of running tracks and football fields. But Woodbury also meditated on what it meant to build what was, in the mid-20th century, still a relatively new kind of structure. In a revealing moment, in the preface that frames the book, Woodbury writes of the venue's function. He writes, "Seating structures are called upon to accommodate increasing crowds and to sift them into orderly groups." For Woodbury, as for Frame, the focus is not on the field, and it certainly isn't the game. Instead, he fixes his mind on how to manage the flows and stases of bodies in attendance. To sift crowds into groups is to sort them, to control them, to discipline their movements and their behaviors. Where Frame's tools were 6-foot-tall high school, college, and seminary students, Woodbury worked with steel and concrete, but both saw their work as directed toward producing a social order by shaping how audience members enter, move through, sit within, and leave a place of cultural performance. It's telling that when Woodbury was enumerating the types of venues included within his ambit, he wrote of, quote, "an assembly structure with its enclosure used for athletic games or similar purposes," exactly what we'd expect from someone who designed the Orange Bowl, but also seating structures for basketball, skating rinks, high-lie games, balconies for gymnasiums, auditoriums, armories, and coliseums. What matters about an assembly structure is how it organizes the people sitting inside of it, not the thing that those people come to see. What I want to propose today is that Frame and Woodbury were onto something. The spaces that accommodate cultural events are engineered spaces, technological assemblages of concrete, metal, architected enclosures, mass-produced equipment, information technologies, and various forms of skilled and unskilled human labor that together enforce Western and white notions of proper behavior. As Langdon Winter might have put it, the event venue is an artifact that has politics. Such a stance casts aside the content and focuses on the building. While critics have long posited that cultural forms such as literature, theater, music, and sport cultivate, control, and discipline readers, viewers, listeners, spectators, and auditors, I'm taking a different tack. I'm going to borrow from a long tradition in media theory. The venue designer's concern is with the medium rather than the message. McLuhan's famous dictum that the medium is the message is often misunderstood as a claim that the medium we choose to send a message says more than any message that it might carry. This may be so, but McLuhan's claim about a medium's message is actually a bit different. What he says is that it's to do with what he calls, quote, the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. A technology's message, its meaning, lies in its impact on the organization of society and how it shapes everyday life. Deploying media theory here allows us to imagine that a building where cultural performance unfolds can help shape not only that performance, but also the society of which it is a constituent part. Despite the dominant focus in both vernacular conversations and academic media studies on communication technologies, media studies as an intellectual formation has long taken a sweeping view of its subject. Recently, media scholars have turned their attention to such objects as cables, oceans, and petroleum products. But at even as formative an event as the 1959 Tamiment Institute seminar, a really foundational moment in the history of media studies, Paul Lazarsfeld, himself a key exponent of early media studies, worried, quote, that too much emphasis was being given to print and television when infrastructure, automobiles, and architecture were also media. Since antiquity, institutions that stage cultural events have been concerned with crowd management. But in Frayne and Woodbury's time, there were new challenges. Mass production, mass culture, and mass movements all pulled at the early 20th century public assembly facility. What I will show today is how venue designers and owners assembled a set of technological artifacts to produce calm crowds. I'll do this by presenting evidence from trade literature published by the manufacturers of equipment, such as turnstiles, barriers, and seats. I'm going to leave open today the question of how actual crowds responded to this equipment. And I'll give you a hint. They sometimes jump the turnstile. I'll leave that question aside for today in order to show how the idea of the large cultural crowd was accommodated in the specific cultural framework of the industrialized United States in the early 20th century. What you'll see is that Woodbury's concern with sifting crowds into orderly groups and Frayne's approach to the racial organization of the crowd at that Miami boxing match are wholly representative of the way that large venues were conceived, designed, built, and operated. Why was it so important that crowds be sifted into orderly groups? The modern American assembly facility, public assembly facility, arrives alongside increasing urbanization, which simultaneously presented new economic possibilities to cultural programmers and conjured lingering 19th century anxieties about crowds. Psychological and theoretical reckoning with crowds emerged in the mid-1800s in continental Europe as psychologists and criminologists, most famously the French criminologist Gustave Le Bon, they developed tools to analyze masses of people who gathered in protest. The founding gesture of crowd theory was Le Bon's contention that people lose their individuality in a crowd and therefore pose a unique destabilizing danger to states and social hierarchies. As Christian Borch notes, 19th century European elites understood the crowd as a threat that demanded a response. Crowd theory's American uptake echoed these concerns, even as the fear of the mob was folded into a generalized suspicion of cities. American crowd management imagined that these suspicions could be addressed by deploying what Borch called state-of-the-art scientific knowledge and practical strategies for the management of crowds. Still, in both American and European varieties, crowd theory largely ignored what George Roudet identified as audience crowds, and Robert Holton called public assembly as such. This was a lacuna that fed what Mark Harrison critiqued as the conflation of crowd and riot. So there's this hole in crowd theory. They think about protests and demonstrations. They don't think about intentional crowds quite as often, especially in earlier crowd theory moments. The taming of audience crowds became important as urban agglomerations produced increasingly large gatherings around cultural performance. Stadiums weren't new, but they had gone missing for quite some time. Woodbury notes that the first modern American stadium was only built in 1903. The urban concentration of large populations and the accompanying improvements to transportation created conditions of possibility for more people to come from a greater landmass to attend events and head home afterward. It's perhaps not surprising that Elias Canetti, who wrote some 70 years later, after this urbanization of the West, and who serves as the other bookend to the crowd theory canon, he did attend to audience crowds, and he specifically addresses the technologies that regulate the flows of spectator bodies. As the University of Chicago anthropologist William Mazzarella notes, such institutions seek to capture the crowd and its energy, not so much to stifle crowd energy as to harness it within ritual forms that will preserve it at moderate levels. In short, the early 20th century stadium and its sibling facilities in the performing arts, the theater, the music hall, the opera house, these buildings sat at the crossroads of competing social imperatives and anxieties. The desire among urban populations to spend some of their growing disposable incomes on what Kathy Price called cheap amusements was serviced by the entrepreneurs who sought to gather those bodies and their money. All the while, those entrepreneurs deployed more or less scientifically engineered products and services to stave off the anxieties that crowds of lower and middle class people provoked among members of the capitalist class who sat atop the social structure. This is a story we see again and again, from price riots in English theaters to ballparks that separated spectators by class or race. PJ Carlino, he's at Cal State Sacramento, he just got a great job there. He's shown that these distinctions were often reinforced by the different chairs that were provided in different sections in early American ballparks, and the barriers that separated the fences, and even there were like moats that were intentionally put between grandstands and boxes to keep different classes of spectators separate. This is the work of sifting crowds into orderly groups, and it matters because it establishes the terrain on which the public can encounter the human arts of expression, dramatic, musical, athletic, or otherwise. Venues accomplish this work by melding technical expertise and a notion of crowd psychology. Both the design of the buildings and the technologies that were installed within them were wrapped in the idea that crowds could be sifted, their behaviors could be calmed, their energies could be channeled to profits, and their potential for violence could be dissipated. Today, I'm going to show you 3 of these technologies. It all starts with a click. The turnstile is a highly visible element of an admission system that performs 2 related tasks. First, it counts bodies. And second, it separates those bodies marked for admission from those lacking the proper credentials. The first and largest industrial turnstile manufacturer was the Perry Turnstile Company. The chief selling point of their mid-century flagship product, the registering turnstile, was its ability to impose order on a crowd by counting its members. To count, Perry wrote in some of its promotional literature, to count is to control. The turnstile's trick was to isolate individual humans. One late 1940s or early 1950s Perry information sheet boasted of what it called the space between the turnstile's arms. It was carefully calculated to give ample room for one person, but too little for 2. Stefan Hoerner describes turnstiles as apparatuses of separation. They separate a chaotic stream, Hoerner writes, of compressed bodies into sequenced units, and thus allow a controlled, accelerated, and rhythmic circulation of the crowd. But this was not a purely mechanical operation. Turnstile manufacturers claimed that order could only be imposed upon bodies by imposing order on minds. Indeed, Perry boasted repeatedly that it sold turnstiles with ideas built into them. This bit of sloganeering organized Perry's entire pitch to its potential customers. In brochures, Perry declared that, quote, psychology has always played an important part in the science of crowd control. Perry positions its turnstiles as one component of what it calls a studied scientific system planned with knowledge of crowd behavior. Anchored in the conviction that, quote, human beings react in certain specific ways to the stimuli of their environment, Perry presented his turnstiles as part of a comprehensive set of cues that would promote cooperation and docility. Psychologically, Perry wrote, the combination of turnstiles and guards stimulates the employee or visitor to better behavior and willingness to do the right thing. The right thing for Perry is a matter of moving in the right direction, under the right conditions, at the right time. In a workplace, such as the war plant where Perry equipped in the 1940s with turnstiles in a clockhouse. This meant that employees passed through turnstiles at the start and the end of their shift. This diagram shows an assemblage of crowd control mechanisms that maintain automated security at the plant, all while efficiently providing a mechanism to account for hours worked. In a theater, this means that properly ticketed spectators move through either turnstiles or what American theater designers Harold Burris Meyer and Edward C. Cole called admission control. In this diagram, representing the traffic flows in an idealized theater, Burris, Meyer, and Cole draw the turnstile moment as a bottleneck that rationalizes the crowd. In this drawing, we can see the turnstile sifting the crowds into orderly groups. So you kind of see this point here where they call it admission control. Everything comes in on this side, flows through that bottleneck, and flows out the other. Perry's machines were also sold on the basis of their ability to enforce rules that discriminated among different kinds of patrons. In a Buffalo, New York theater, Perry installed a turnstile that aimed to eliminate fraud in the form of cashiers allowing adults to enter for child prices. Perry wrote, the lights can be readily seen by anyone in the lobby or on the sidewalk outside, and it acts as a deterrent. Here, not only can management check on an employee's work, but a display of any malfeasance controls workers, making their honesty a matter for public judgment. The work of sifting bodies is actuated by the cashier, but the turnstile apparatus ensures that the bodies that pass are properly categorized and that they enter the venue as individuals. The 20th century turnstile thus sits as a conspicuous piece of sorting equipment at the venue's front door, imposing a moderating effect on both arriving crowds and frontline workers. The turnstile produces, with its audible click, the definitive moment of arrival. Once through the turnstile, you are inside the venue. But this arrival has already begun the process of atomization and control that processes the crowd as a collection of discrete individuals. Indeed, the turnstile's crowd is the sound, the turnstile's click is the sound of a crowd becoming an audience. But turnstiles don't act alone. The approach to the turnstile and the path away from it can be shaped by other crowd control and traffic management devices. You can kind of see one of them right here, a barrier, or its cousins, the post, the rope, the stanchion. Perry notes that people react favorably to impersonal suggestion in the form of a light railing, which guides them in a given path. The company's understanding of human psychology held that people prefer being guided subliminally by environmental cues. They prefer that to direct instruction from another human. Barriers in the form of turnstiles and light low railings act as symbols, suggesting definite social reactions, Perry writes. If the turnstile's function is to execute a binary decision at a fixed point by either granting passage or denying it, traffic management's devices act on bodies in motion, channeling them this way or that. Manufacturers of technologies like ropes, posts, and stanchions frame their products as psychological interventions as well. Lawrence Metal Products, which fashioned itself as the undisputed leader in the field of crowd control, explained in its 1963 catalog that its posts and ropes find application in controlling traffic, forming lines for providing for orderly admission and protecting valuable displays and works of art. You can see on the right panel some of the different scenarios where Lawrence imagined its equipment being used. These photographs that it uses to bolster its claims show equipment that appears at once sturdy and decidedly unimposing. metal posts joined by ropes encased in various materials, signaling higher or lower degrees of elegance. The keywords in the brochure: order is maintained. Controlling the venue was as much a matter of compelling audience members to comport themselves in a calm and orderly fashion as it was an exercise in physically constraining movements. Many of the traffic control technologies deployed in the spaces of cultural performance are clearly not impenetrable. You can jump the rope, but they are environmental cues in the form of railings and ropes that operate on the audience's ability to regulate its own behavior. An evening at the theater or an afternoon at the game might feel carefree and unregulated, but the experience is highly structured, constrained, and choreographed. Lawrence marketed a soft barrier that demonstrates this internal constraint mechanism. The Tensor Barrier system, well suited to theaters, opera houses, and recital halls, not to mention banks, government offices, and transport terminals. You're probably familiar with this thing. It features retractable nylon belts that stretch from post to post. Though the barrier is easily breached, Lawrence boasted that it provides a highly effective physical and psychological barrier. You'll note the attendant's posture and her uniform, totally relaxed, but faux military. Her function is ornamental. She's not a naval officer. She's not a constable. She's an usher or a ticket taker. The orderliness imposed by Tensor Barrier is psychological as much as it is physical, deputizing audience members' own socialized, internalized sense of proper behavior. Lawrence positioned its wares as appropriate for a wide range of settings. The specifics of the event were less significant than the width of the corridor, the number of the attendees, and the capacity of the venue. By standardizing the movements of audiences through the venue, traffic management devices remove from the spectator possibilities of both self-determination and collective organization. Along the way, the work of the turnstile has been subtly reinforced. Impersonal and suggestive, these devices ensure that audience members remain docile as they find their way to their seats. Those seats themselves were also crowd control devices. Witold Rymczewski, the architectural historian, understands the chair as a first-person utterance. The chair, for Rymczewski, is a form of cultural expression. He writes, "The way we choose to sit and what we choose to sit on says a lot about us, our values, our tastes, things we hold dear." But seating can also be a second-person command issued by the party provisioning the chair to the party who sits, an indication of the values, tastes, and affinities of those who choose the furniture. He who pays the vendor calls the stool. Not only this, but the provision of seating in performance venues was understood explicitly in the 20th century as a means of shaping the behavior of crowds. Elias Canetti noted that the arrangement of seating in both stadiums and theaters ensures that, quote, everyone is very well aware of his own separate existence, and the seats are arranged so that people are not too closely crushed. In a theater, each seat is neatly separated from the rest. Each man has his place and sits or stands by himself. Keeping the crowd seated is essential to keeping it tame. Elias continues, the spectator can sit. They are free to stamp their feet, but they stay in the same place. The crowd can perform its satisfaction and its discontent, but only within the strict rows and columns of seats. Spectators' feet are meant for stamping, not marching. Their hands are meant only for applause. The regulation of spectator movements in sport parallels late 19th and 20th century efforts to cultivate attentive theater and music audiences who understood their role to be defined by their ability to observe, to make aesthetic judgments, and to regulate their behavior. In music halls, Emily Thompson writes, listening became a way to worship at the temple of great art. Kimberly Janero writes that the bourgeois theater increasingly sought to, quote, create an atmosphere in which spectators would remain silent, seated, passive, and polite. As Canetti writes, a normal theater is arranged with the intention of pinning people down and allowing them only the use of their hands and voices. The use of their legs is restricted as far as possible. Indeed, A.H. Andrews and Company marketed a number of upper chairs with 2 holes in the bottom of a rear panel sized to accommodate the feet of the patron in the row behind. These holes, to me, they look like the stocks used in medieval or early modern punishment. This is from 1886, this catalog drawing. It depicts the immobilized spectator, hands dangling off the ends of the armrest, feet blocking other spectators from moving laterally. As Baz Kershaw notes, applause became more important to Western theaters in the second half of the 20th century as other forms of audience engagement were reduced in order that audiences might be prevented from becoming, as he puts it, unruly. By keeping spectators' feet still and channeling their energy to their hands, venues could mitigate the possibility of the crowd erupting. It comes as little surprise then that manufacturers of stadium and theater seating deployed the twin vocabularies of order and comfort to market their products. In a 1930s brochure, the Detroit Atlas Portable Bleacher Company framed its steel bleachers in terms of their calming effects. They write, "There is no element more conducive to good sportsmanship than a well-seated, orderly crowd, and no unseated crowd is liable to be orderly." Detroit Atlas depicted a well-regulated crowd as a source of steady revenues. They wrote, "Good seats and receipts are synonymous." The energy of the crowd is channeled through the bleachers such that the audience may feel, for example, the excitement brought by a powerboat race. But the bleachers' steel girders absorb that energy and return the crowd to its calm resting state. A wave that rises and then falls. Detroit Atlas writes, "At an exciting finish, everyone jumps to their feet, stamps, yells, and crashes back from excitement. All this surging crowd has no more effect on the Detroit Atlas than it would have had on a concrete stadium." In theaters, contemporary crowds often behaved differently. While the sports crowd stamps its feet, the discursive repackaging of theater seats emphasizes silence and sound absorption as sought-after qualities. One of the upmarket chairs in the 1930s Steel Furniture Company catalog, number 6881, promises to meet the constantly increasing demand for beautiful, sound-absorbent theater seating at a moderate price. Number 6881's more luxurious cousin, number 6863, was Steel Furniture's top model, which the company described as the peer among theater chairs. Like 6881, 6883 had deep, plush cushions, presenting a large, soft surface that would reduce echoes and ensure quiet in the auditorium. Underlining the company's commitment to quiet, both chairs and the entire Steel Furniture line were regularly furnished with a noiseless ball and socket hinge. By 1936, Steel Furniture had become the Irwin Seating Company, but their devotion to comfort and silence persisted, and they wrote, "Maximum comfort, beauty of design, architectural harmony, and silent, trouble-free mechanisms are built-in features that distinguish the Irwin line." By emphasizing their chairs' silent operations, manufacturers were able to frame theater and opera house chairs in terms of their ability to produce a calm environment that naturally directs attention away from the boxes and toward the stage. The logic of the theater seat allows the crowd to be gathered without inviting spontaneity. The 20th century theater audience's dispositions, postures, arrangements, and reactions are all subdued and structured by the neat rows of well-appointed seats. No intermingling, no identification with fellow spectators. Nothing in earlier eras of dramatic performance might lead to violence or riots. Kennedy observes, even their applause has its prescribed times. In general, people clap only when they are supposed to. Movements too are limited by the arrangements of seats. The passage through the seating areas is tightly constrained, such that, as Kennedy puts it, only one man at a time can pass between the rows of seats. But even this passage becomes an operation to be smoothed. In the late 1920s or 30s, the Truxess Chair Company manufactured a theater seat marketed to the burgeoning cinema industry that had a notch carved out of the right-hand side of each seat, thus allowing seated patrons to swivel momentarily so that another patron might pass. This chair successfully eliminates the only inconvenience, move too fast, and annoyance of our theaters today. This was imagined to be the only inconvenience and annoyance. That speaks loudly of how it is that Truccess and its sibling companies imagined theaters to function. What are the values, the tastes, the things held dear by the audience member who can only be thought to perceive another person's passing as an inconvenience? What vision of audienceship motivates a venue to spare its patrons from such a bother? If the executive chair testifies to power, as Rutschensky said, the mass-produced theater chair testifies to pliancy, a notion of cultural performance as a consumer good, and a theory of the crowd that exists to be harnessed, not to challenge authority. In 1976, in the Bronx, Yankee Stadium was rededicated, and the ceremony led at least one attendee to reflect on what an event venue is for. The facility, which dated to 1923, had been built and furnished according to the logics of William Woodbury, Harry Turnstiles, Lawrence Metal, and Irwin Seating. I haven't been able to document it, but I would be shocked if Andy Frayne didn't have a team that worked Yankee Stadium. By 1976, it was showing its age, and the owners sought public funds to rebuild the structure. Although New York in the 1970s was deeply scarred by cascading fiscal crises, the city volunteered the financing to retain the Yankees. A new ballpark was fitted into the old building's shell, not unlike a bathtub line. On opening day, Alan Cohen, who was then the president of the Madison Square Garden Corporation, took an even broader view, suggesting to a newspaper reporter that the new Yankee Stadium served a civic mission. Cohen said, "If cities as we know them today are to survive, they must offer facilities that make men civilized." Suggestive as it is of Arnoldian notions of culture, Cohen's formulation, the facilities that make men civilized, is a curious one. It's not athletic or dramatic performance itself that Cohen imagines to have the power to civilize people. He specifically invokes Lincoln Center, Yankee Stadium, and Madison Square Garden, but not the Metropolitan Opera, not the Yankees, not the Knicks. For Cohen, these facilities, the buildings themselves, generate civilized behavior. The best which has been thought or said can only survive in the bosom of the best that has been built and equipped. Both the 1923 and 1976 iterations of Yankee Stadium were equipped with Perry turnstiles, but Cohen's comment suggests that cultural performance and its controlled spaces may have grander implications. The argument I presented this afternoon shows that the discourse surrounding early 20th century crowd control technologies was often focused on producing calm in order to conserve social hierarchies or as an adjunct to efficiency or profits. But Cohen's remarks imply that performance venues ought to do more than ensure that audience members proceed to their seats calmly and remain orderly once there. The invocation of civilization suggests that stadiums, concert halls, and theaters, the architectural media of performance, participate in the project of teaching citizens what Freud called the manner in which the relationships of men to one another, their social relationships, are regulated. It suggests that they are among the material artifacts that Foucault would recognize as defining, controlling, and sorting populations in order that society may establish and defend itself. Every bit as much as the specific content of the event itself, the fact of attending a cultural event can be a component of a civilizing pedagogy. While the program may be raucous, bawdy, even culturally, socially, or politically subversive, venues themselves sculpt their patrons' behavior, furnished as they are with machinery that renders audiences orderly, calm, and predictable. Arriving from outside, crowds are sorted by clicking turnstiles, guided by silent barriers and ropes, and slotted into neat rows of seats. As this machinery shapes their movements and defines their itineraries, crowd control technologies civilize crowds by training them to keep their feet still, imagine themselves as audiences, and applaud on cue.
So Scott asked me to moderate, this is a pretty ruly crowd. If he needs that much help with that, I hope the chair play it, and if anybody else has questions, I think Laura, you might have some from the audience possibly. Help. Sure.
That one of your slides was of practice. It made me wonder about the application of all this to industrial life. We were focusing on education, but it seems it's probably wrong. It's a really great whole factory. So I just wondered if you, how much you thought about it as part of your project to look at the industrial application.
Yeah, there are connections. It's a great question. Thank you. There are connections. Lindy Biggs, is that her name? She's a historian of technology. She's written quite a bit about the choreography and the management of work within a factory. And some of the manufacturers that I drew on today, they were sending equipment to factories as well as to police departments and parks departments, and not only to theaters and stadiums and arenas. So yeah, I think it's very much interlinked and deeper in sort of the history of arts management in the 20th century. The logics of the factory, they very quickly get imported. So in other parts of this book project, I'm looking at sort of how information technology is used to sculpt audiences and manage the relationship between the audience and the institution, and manage the work that is done by box office personnel, ushers, and sort of the audience-facing staff who interact directly with the workers. It very quickly becomes like an industrialized form of labor, much like factory. So yeah, it's a great question. Your intuition was spot on.
For the questions, would you mind coming a little closer to the microphone just so that the online audience can hear? Sorry.
Yes, yeah, picking up on what Eve said, I started immediately thinking of airports too. I mean, all the huge crowd control they do there, because you know those little tape like lines. I mean, are you going to look at that sort of thing, or is it primarily entertainment venues?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Also, it's one has to draw lines.
Yes.
And so for me, the question of crowd control is interesting in part because of spaces like airports, and you know, as I continue revising this, this is under review right now, and one of the readers asked a question very similar to that. You know, what are the connections between the ways that spaces like airports and train terminals are regulated? And I think, you know, in all of these installations, they're functioning as ways of controlling flows and also creating good conditions for surveillance. The airport is obviously, our modern airports are famously always under surveillance. Every move that they make is monitored and metered. Increasingly, this is the case in our performance venues as well. Companies like Ticketmaster and Live Nation, which form these functions of creating a commodity out of something that's fleeting, something that's hard to pin down and turn into a commodity.
Is that good? Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for this, totally fascinating. I'm predictably going to ask about sonic crowd control. And so, I mean, that's a huge territory, right? But in the specific cases that you're talking about, do you see attention to the texture and shape in terms of acoustics as a component of crowd control, and then also traditions like, you know, the chime as a way of sort of entraining bodies to behave in certain ways? So just an invitation to talk about that.
That's an awesome question. I've not thought about that, other than just in like the, you know, like the, I'm sure you're much more familiar with this literature than I am, but like the Jonathan Stern, sounds like the Mall of America. This is what control sounds like. Keep the kids out, keep the adults in, whatever. Yeah, I haven't given that much thought. I do know that facilities like these, they tend to be intensely sound design. Certainly the auditorium itself, sound design, this is what Emily Thompson's work is. She's a historian at Princeton. She has this amazing book, The Soundscape of Modernity, which is about Symphony Hall in Boston, primarily about Symphony Hall. It's also about the invention of modern acoustics, how it is that a space is designed to sound a certain way. When designers of arenas go about their work, there's this trade-off that they have to make, because typically speaking, a basketball arena is also available as a concert venue, but the sound requirements for those two purposes are quite different from one another. And they create a different feeling for the audience. And I would imagine it's also intended to produce a different type of behavior. Like the cavernous, echoey sound of a basketball arena is meant to create a certain kind of excitement, but maybe the concert crowd is meant to have less resonance and greater control. The lights are out. I'm not sure. I don't have like evidence to back that up. It's all intuition. It's a great question. I should write that chapter.
Awesome.
I'll talk to you about it.
I have a question. First of all, thanks for the talk. You said that earlier. So there wasn't a lot of explicit discussion of public safety. There's a lot about control surveillance. I'm thinking about like especially the shift from Premier League soccer arenas post Hillsborough disaster, where they would literally tear down the terraces, control class and gender, and create more seating. And in the summer, the men's Euros at Wembley, where they were breaking into the stadium and creating unsafe, at least in framed unsafe environments. And how do they talk about the tension between control and turning a mob into consumers with a safe? Was public safety before the same?
Yeah, yes. I mean, in all the manuals, there's gestures towards safety. So in another piece of this, I spent some time looking through kind of like trade books or like insider publications for the managers of public assembly facilities. I'm thinking one by someone named Don Jewell, sort of the 70s or early 80s. When he talks about safety, he'll sort of like make gestures to public safety as his own good, but his audience is people like him who managed and operated these arenas and theaters and convention centers, and it was usually framed in terms of liability. So public safety was a means to ensure that you didn't get sued, a means to ensure that a Hillsborough disaster didn't occur because it's terrible, but also because like it's bad for the institution to deal with the insurance claims and the lawsuits. But yeah, the other thing that I would think of, or that I could bring to you, is there are in textbooks that are used in college instruction for events management courses. I don't think we have a program here that teaches it, but I might be wrong. I have one in my office. I think it's called Standing Room Only. It's one of those big textbooks from the code or something like that. They talk a bit, I think, about I don't think they talk about Hillsborough. I think they talk about Altamont. The Stones played, and there was like the Crush in I guess it was the late 60s, early 70s. And they sort of discuss this, and they say in no uncertain terms, festival seating is never to be used. because it's dangerous. It's viewed as a threat to public safety, which then has the consequences if you're trying to manage the performance and manage the crowd. Of course, public performances often do use festival seating. We see it in Newport every summer, in the Ryan Center. I've forgotten the person's name, just canceled. If he ever makes it here, what's that? No, it was a music artist who was supposed to perform. They had to cancel the performance. Solo G, right? Yeah, hopefully that will be rescheduled. But I'm sure that will be festival seating on the floor. But yeah, this tension does surface in terms of like. But I should don't know if it's intention so much, because the control and the public safety kind of work together, right? Like seats, it's easier as these companies were showing. It's easier to control seated audiences. The title of the talk was drawn from that feature manufacturer. The no unseated crowd is liable to be orderly. I think the idea is fit together. And so public safety depends on your point of view. Like if you're the public safety is really important. And if you're the operator, it's important, but it's also a vulnerability.
I have a question. For events like Rocky Horror Picture or sort of grab nights at old theaters where the crowd is meant to be disorderly, is there any like systematic subversion of this, or is it just how did you find that in your research? How that works?
It's an awesome question. I was hoping somebody would ask. It's a great question. So yeah, like what the world I described is super orderly, super neat, and everything like lines up and fits into place, just so. And we all know it doesn't often work out that way. So Rocky Horror is, like there's lots of audience participation and standing and dance moves and whatever. I won't. And then at popular music concerts, the audience often stands. They don't sit, and there's often movement and there's crowd surfing and mosh pits and things like that. Sports crowds, there can be some unseated moments. Even in theater, which I think has an unfair reputation sometimes as being a staid art form. Theater has a long history from antiquity all the way through to contemporary theater. Can be a very boisterous event, not only at those designated moments, but to take the example of Rocky Horror Picture Show, this is something that Boz Kershaw, who's a great audience researcher, has done quite a bit of work on audiences and applause. He kind of makes this move where he says things like that are actually, they're not subversive, because you're supposed to stand up, and moshing and crowd surfing and doing the time warp and the wave and all of these sort of unseated, unstill things, they're all still within the strictures of whatever the context is for that particular moment, that particular event. So he would say that the logic of the controlled crowd does in fact include this kind of thing, because that's part of the performance of being civilized, being disciplined in this particular way, to act as a member of an audience who behaves in a certain way, who claps at the end or in the middle, or screams for joy when your favorite song is played, or when the home run is hit, or the football does whatever a football does. So this behavior that you're talking about, I think can be integrated back into it. It doesn't mean that subversion is impossible. It just means that it's harder. It might be just a larger story of capital absorbing subversion for its own purposes. Or, yeah, I guess absorbing subversive behaviors for its own purposes.
That was a fantastic talk. Thank you. I wanted to ask about electric light. And when you mentioned light, precisely allows concert halls and opera houses change the audience dynamic where everybody can see everybody else all the time and feel very different kind of thing. During the performance was tolerated. And so you're talking about the interpolation crowd into an audience And when you get to speak or react, how you get to react, and say in classical music, when you practically move, it's still a vexed question. I don't know from your research if the manufacturer of these systems talk about how light can control
It's a great question, and in part, I think it points out like the ways that different technological circumstances can correlate with different kinds of behaviors and different kinds of normalized audience and performer behaviors. So, yeah, I mean, I know that Travis, you're a scholar of Shakespeare, and a little I remember from my study of Shakespeare in college was, there was a very different audience function during Shakespeare's time, and a very different audience function in 18th century, 19th century here. So the equipment that I shared with you, like the materials I was working with, they're all very much from like the very tail end of the 19th and then into the 20th century, when the ability to precisely dim lights is present in most of these performance spaces. Performances are happening at night; they're not happening during the day. Athletics over the course of the 20th century increasingly moves its events to the nighttime hours in order to get working people time to come, audiences on television eventually. All of this made possible by electric light, control of that electric light. So yeah, I mean, I think the argument that I think I'm hearing from you, that the ability to control light interpolates audience behavior is true. It's correct. I've only encountered it very little. It's probably something I should spend some time paying more attention to. But I've read a little bit about like jumbotrons, things like that, which is different from the electric light, although it's a light, visible light technology. But yeah, I mean, we're very much adjusted as 21st century people living in the United States to a certain codified use of light to cue how we behave. The lights flash 3 times, it's time to get back in. Or the lights go down, the show is beginning, the lights come up, now you can clap. And so I think this equipment, like with the spot for your feet, or to pass, to allow the person to pass easily without interrupting, I think it's an adjunct to the electric light. I think they fit together, because I think the logics of the electric light in the house and on the stage, and the seat as a controlling mechanism that keeps people down and keeps people in the rows, I think those fit together. Does that answer? Okay. I think that's great. Thank you. It's a great question.
I was just curious about your use of the word civilizing. I was wondering why you're choosing to use that word, and if that's the word that people were using. Why they might have been using civilizing.
Yeah.
As the description of what it was that they were supposed to.
Right. So it's a word that I'm using because it was used by, I mean, the last person we heard from was Alan Cohen, who says these are the things that make us civilized. And this notion of this equipment as being civilizing, creating a Western identity, creating well-behaved, well-formed subjects of liberal democracy. I've not yet been able to pull out as much as some of the people has, but I sense there's an undercurrent of not just proper behavior, but white behavior encoded into all of these. Which types of venues get this seats, what kind of behavior is expected, who's allowed to sit, where they're allowed to sit. All of this is kind of baked into these technologies. And so, yeah, when I use the word civilized, I don't mean to imply that there is some objective notion of civilization that I'm telling you is how we should all behave, but rather that the term civilization was deployed by Alan Cohen, by Perry, Turnstile, by some of the other people who are working in this moment to think about how should these venues be designed, how should they be equipped, how should they be operated. This is a term that they use to say, like, the stuff that we're gonna mount, the performances we're gonna stage in these buildings, that's the mark of a cultivated civilization, a proper culture. And this is how people should enter, and this is how they should move through it, and this is how they ought to sit, and this is how they should be arranged. So yeah, I think that's what civilization is signifying as it's been used in this discourse.
Scott, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you everyone for coming. And thank you to Matt for moderating and Laura for handling all the logistical and technological details. I hope you all will join us again next month on October 21st when Jessica Frazier is with us today. We'll talk about her current work on transnational feminism. And that will be Thursday, October 21st at 12:30. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day. It's great to see you in person.